What if the very instruments of retaliation were the chains intended to enslave? Why would a damaged and voiceless woman turn fire into justice? And why does the name Hannah continue to reverberate from Mississippi's ashes in 1859? To ensure you don't miss any of our investigations, subscribe to the channel right once and enable notifications if you want to follow true stories that defy time and uncover hidden realities. Hannah discovered how to make her breathing quieter than a prayer in 1859 while living on a plantation in Mississippi, where it looked like the air itself was owned. When the fields were a dark sea and the quarters were still, she rose before the light and moved with the deliberate care of someone who had been repeatedly taught that pain was attracted by noise. Her hands were taken by work, but not her thoughts. She was bent by pain. Return, but she won't. Under a sun that didn't care who suffered beneath it, she carried water, cleaned floors, and gathered cotton until her fingertips were raw and shiny. She maintained a name her mother had given her and protected it like a live flame, even if they termed it property. Casual and aloof, the colonel measured lives the way gamblers count cards. As boisterous as dogs during a hunt, his brothers chuckled at what they repeatedly took. The day was broken like green branches by orders. Whips were suspended from corroded nails from prolonged, frequent use. Like pines in a storm that never left the horizon, men and women swayed under those. Commands straightened and then swayed once again. Hannah figured out the math behind her fear. How to move aside without appearing to do so, and what to say and what not to say. Where to conceal and where to hold her eyes. She had been sold into this world after being born into slavery on another. She had thin white ladders of scars on her shoulders, and a thicker climb of scar tissue where a master's ring had bitten hard across her rib cage. Her reflection shook in the iron-lipped bucket as she drew water from the pump. Her face was as steady as stone, and her mouth hardly moved. But beneath that silence were 1,000 observations. She was secretly aware of which board on the rear steps squeaked, because of the sound the key ring made against the colonel's belt and the way his hand slid there whenever someone's speech was too slow. She was as familiar with the house rhythms as a midwife is with a child's turning. The continuous slop of washing, the flute-thin whistle of kettles, the drum beat in the kitchen, the deep silence that descended whenever the brothers quarreled, and the abrupt scraping of chairs when one of them chose to stand up to stop the disagreement. She was aware of the windows that clogged during the summer and which, after midnight, lifted easily. She gathered herself in those brief moments, much like someone gathers cloth before a strenuous ascent. She went back to the quarters and shuffled between the others like a hush. A church. Salve was needed for someone's back. It was time to bandage someone's wrist. The momentary respite of another's gaze was necessary for someone's eyes. To prepare for the following day, there was grief that needed to be folded and put aside. In the darkness, names were whispered. Husbands and wives are split up like cattle, mothers are stolen, and children are sold. They were all in the night, and the night was not for sale. Thus, they engaged in conversation. Instead of using the White House calendar, Hannah used the little mercies that endured beneath it, such as a shared heel of bread, a song hummed low enough to go under a door, or a loaned needle that repaired a torn hem. She heard her mother's voice within those mercies, telling her that a person is a river with a mind of its own, and not a field to be crossed. As soon as the colonel touched her shoulder, she felt the river surge, thick and possessive. She kept it from flooding. Not quite yet. She discovered how to patiently braid stillness. Above her, everything appeared to be set in stone, ledgers, whips, and commands. But under those planks, heat and rain caused the wood to expand and contract. Nothing remained fixed indefinitely. She had the same understanding of that truth, assurance that she recognized the moon's attraction. She worked for her all day under their names. She breathed her own name, which felt like breath after drowning all night long. Sometimes the whiskey smell pulled a memory up by the roots, and other times the colonel's brothers strode past her. She would clench her mouth, her hands would remain still. The memory would then fold back into its drawer when she breathed. She had time to wait. Winter had taught her the lengthy art of waiting, which seemed to go on forever but always came to an end. She observed. She recalled. She persevered. Harvest was the season's lean. The White House gleamed at dusk like a lantern that thought. It was everlasting, haughty with its big windows and verandas. Hannah walked under the light, head low, her steps deliberate. As one, she answered, "Yes, sir, and no, sir." Tide and storm are terms denoting forces that would eventually spend their own money. She was exact because she had suffered. She had learned to listen through suffering. The world pretended not to see the ledger of debts that agony had given her. The ledger was hers. As she turned the page, she started counting backwards, between breaths. The youngster was abducted the day her milk arrived. It took place in the silence of a theft that is practiced. A door opened, the hands of a lady extended. Later, a price would be marked down in a ledger. Hannah's body continued to recall the loss. She learned to swallow the kind of cry that frightens birds out of trees, and she tied a strip of fabric over her chest to keep the pain from leaking over her work. There was no halt in the globe. What was taken was not given back by the world. With the reckless joy of men who never pay for anything with their own hearts, the colonel's brothers strolled by her. Like winter, grief sunk into her. It didn't howl. It applied pressure. It taught her to navigate both like though she were waiting for a slow river, making the days difficult and the nights hollow. Her hands remained submissive as her mind traveled the distances she was unable to. From the quarters to the large, house and back, she counted the number of footsteps. The number of breaths it took to get from the cotton rows to the well was counted by her. Where mercy failed to steady her, numbers did. After the brothers visited each seam, she observed the women in the quarters stitching themselves together using candle endurance. The elders sung hymns that could not be heard beyond a cupped palm and applied balm to bruises. The choreography of terror was taught to the younger ones. How to fold the body into a more manageable object. How to avoid appearing to gaze past. A face. Hannah remembered every single name. Sparks don't ask for permission, so she held them like matching flints. The colonel stored his collections, ledgers, keys, and tales he told his guests about duty and domination in the large residence. He used punishment and yield to gauge the world. He invoked God to see the order he had created, and when he went to sleep, he left God outside in the yard. Like a shadow who had memorized the floors, Hannah moved inside. That sequence. She discovered how their tempers rose or fell with alcohol, the subtle distinctions between a brother's swagger and the colonel's stride, and the rhythm of footfall. The days were heavy with work. Cotton parted like grumpy jaws beneath her fingers. Her wrists were scorched by lye. Heat piled upon heat till it gleamed on the skin. She discovered where the small mercies should be kept. A refreshing glass of water reserved for a buddy. A pocket containing a cornbread crust. In a place dedicated to the minor things, she maintained her humanity with a look that said, "I see you when the mouth could not." The opposite. She occasionally considered her child's hands as the lamp smoke dwindled close to morning. The way your fingers curl, as though to let the world know that you plan to cling on. She saw a market where people feigned not to see what they were purchasing, a stranger's vehicle. She folded it back into the silence where she kept it after imagining a future she could not touch. The remainder of her. She no longer prayed for tenderness. She prayed that her grief would have a purpose. Word spread around the fields of other locations where a master had not woken up, where a night had become unpleasantly noisy, or where someone had slipped a chain. Stories like that were passed along in the rhythm of washing boards and the hems of clothes. Hannah gave them permission to root. If such nights were possible, they were not created. Rather, they were the result of someone's bold decision. She didn't refer to it as hope. She referred to it as evidence. The brothers became more confident. They learned the wrong lesson from fear. They interpreted bowing backs as devotion, quietness as permission. Shaking in amazement. They were unaware that grief could serve as a foundry. They were unaware that a woman's sorrow could be pounded into a sharp object. Hannah maintained a level gaze, a steady voice, and an accurate debt ledger. With a scribe's precision, she noted every humiliation. By late summer, thunder that would not go away lingered heavy in the air. The colonel's laughter echoed over the balcony like a vow that nothing would ever change as the house sparkled at nightfall, its white boards catching the last of the bruised light. Hannah walked with a controlled step and a straight back beneath that sound. She made no attempt to look to the future. Where her hands were already, she allowed the future to find them. In the something inside her changed from mourning to making. Grief unclenched as the fields ceased to breathe and the kettles ceased to stir in the growing silence after sunset. It was replaced by will. And during that conversation, the initial idea of a response started to solidify. She started by identifying the item that the house had forgotten it had. The cool breath of the pantry. Spiderwebs kept a census in. The crawl area under the rear steps. The tiny key was put in a broken teacup next to the flour barrel rather than on the ring. The study door's small bolt, which slid dry and smooth but became stopped in wet conditions. She patiently tended to these truths, which she carried in the seam of her apron like seeds. After dinner, when the colonel fell asleep, she counted his breaths and the beats between them as his hands were relaxed on the armrest. The moment, whiskey turned rage into boast and boast into clumsy laughter, she wrote when the brothers quarreled. She learned the tides of their carelessness. Oil settled in the lamp room, a sweet, throaty smell that stuck to clothes. And rags lived near the stove, a little mountain of yesterday's labor. As if greeting old neighbors, she tested windows, some lifting, some resisting, some surrendering, if wooed with a knife tip under the sash. She complained here, quieted there, rubbed a dab of lard into a stubborn latch and came back later to find it meek and noiseless. A door that yields without speaking is a door that forgets to warn. Everything went into the ledger she maintained behind her eyes. She observed the wind night after night, learning from smoke from the cookhouse where it leaned at twilight and where it turned toward midnight. Fire was more than just heat. It was a dialogue with the air and a deal with the weather. She refused. To allow her own people were the price, so she studied the back fields, the hollow where the breeze slept, the angle of the trees when storms rolled low, the breath the porch steps exhaled when a man came heavy down them, and she collected tinder, in thoughts rather than hands, and put it in memory's corners. In the quarters, as women talked, knots formed and unformed, and Hannah's fingers learned them again, hitches that hold and slips that snare. She discovered the length, bite, and precise sound a shackle makes when it is closed securely but not loudly. She also learned that rope could bind bodies, but it could also leach doors to banisters, pull handles tight against frames, and turn a corridor into a trap. Chains hung in the shed as though they were resting after honest work, but their iron had pressed too many wrists to merit rest. In harvest weeks, the brothers drank heavily on Fridays, boasted heavily on Saturdays, and woke up late and useless. Padlocks were in a drawer with bent spoons and loose buttons. The colonel valued order. Order has its own blindfold. Some men napped on Sabbath afternoons, while others rode out to check fences that didn't need to be checked. On Sundays, patterns wore paths, and paths lead where a patient mind intends. Hannah traced the shape of the house in her headroom by room hinge to bolt, key to lock, oil to flame, while her thoughts built elsewhere. One night she stood in the hall unseen, holding an empty tray, while she listened to laughter thud against the ceiling. A chain across a knob, a wedge under a threshold, a length of rope attached to a stair post, a brother here, another there, the colonel at his desk with his ledger open, the door closed against noise. She moved them like pieces until each was contained by his own walls, and she collected without collecting a splinter to test a wick, a strip of cloth that would drink. Oil? And the memory of how quickly a flame takes to old pine when the house closed like a fist when the storm finally came. A real one that rattled windows and muddied the road. She practiced her hands against everyday tasks until they forgot how to tremble, and she practiced her face into its practiced calm. She allowed days to pass over her like water over stone, while the stone secretly shaped the water. The world tilted toward Hannah, not because it wanted to, but because it had no other option. She walked her circuit with the same obedient pace she always maintained, and behind her eyes the yo-map glowed sure as a lantern. The men stayed inside, the noise increased, and the doors latched for comfort. The debts were totaled. Rain had washed the afternoon clean, the air heavy and damp, the wind drifting from the fields. She did not bless the night. She accepted it, and in the silence under the thunder, she started counting down. Wind had learned its line. The house, pleased with its own solidity, had taught her every weakness. The colonel retired first, a creature of habit, inside his study with the door drawn, his ledger waiting like a prayer book, a brother lingering, and supper had warmed the men in too. Looseness, whiskey having done the rest, laughter lying on the floorboards like broken glass. The house thought it was protected by its own walls, but Hannah thought otherwise, and she started where the noise would be expected. A bucket clinking in the kitchen, a broom slid across flagstones, the normal business of night. In the parlor, a man boasted swelling and fading, while another pulled a chair onto the back corridor and fell into it as if the chair were the bed he deserved. Then came the smaller work, the work that the house could not hear, a door coaxed shut and clasped with the last syllable of iron, a hinge eased open with the patience of rain on stone, a chain lifted in two hands, weight accepted without complaint, a wedge under a threshold, grain biting grain, and rope married to banister, not nested under the shadow of a rail. She did not hurry. The brother in the hallway snored as she laid out each piece, as though it were a burial cloth for the past. She looped a chain, threw the handle behind him, fed it around the newel, and shut the padlock with a swallow of sound. Next came the parlor. Door, with its glass a dark square of her own outline and a panel warm from lamp heat. She tied the latch to the deep anchor of a stair post. The tiny bolt that preferred dry weather slipped home. A second chain spanned the knob, the key lived in the teacup, and Hannah had taken it. The colonel's scratch of pen in the study paused at the storm's seam, and she felt the pause in her own ribs before moving. She stood in the hall and listened with the attentiveness of a hawk as the first cry knocked dust from a ceiling joist. Habit met its answer and found no purchase. Voices swelled, slurred protest, veering toward command. Hands tested knobs, wood, answered with its honest refuse. She didn't respond to the promises that rang through the panels, money, documents, pardon. Threats followed, brilliant as knives tossed into a tree. She let them clatter and fall. Midwife. Every sound informed her the home had finally heard itself. She dipped and wrung, fed a wick, and placed a rag in a lamp's throat like a letter into a mouth. Fire accepted politely, then requested more, and she responded with the measured offerings she had prepared, a smear along the baseboard, a kiss to the drape hem, and a blessing pressed beneath. Cloth waited where cloth always waited. The colonel's voice came low and edged, the voice that had cost lives now. Smoke found the rooms before flame did. She nursed the flames the way a woman steadies a fever until it breaks the body's stubbornness. They crept, then gathered, then spoke in a tongue the house had never taught them. A third brother threw a shoulder into a panel, and encountered the patient strength of the old pine. Hannah retreated along her map, touch-testing heat, eyes counting breath. Another brother threw himself at the parlor door. The rope responded with the assurance of a job well done. Heat rolled up the stairwell and held it there like a hand. She had left the service door unlatched to spill smoke away from the quarters. Fire followed the path she made for it, like water follows a riverbed. The house started to speak in its deeper voice. She held it, walked past the study one final time, and placed her palm to the panel. Glass starred, paint blistered. The pictures down the corridor trembled in their frames as if asking a question, names hammered from behind wood. Her name strove to be among them. The stair, long accustomed to carrying weight downward, learned the new task of lifting fire toward ceilings and beams. On the other side, the colonel beat the rhythm of a man who had mistaken himself for a god. She said nothing. She had said it all. The room blossomed into day when the first flame shouldered through the parlor drape. The corridor woke to a running red. Hannah entered the kitchen, went around the back entrance, and let the night take her. She didn't glance back yet, since that's for later. The fragrance of the rain had subsided, the wind remained steady, and far behind her, the house raised a roar that was previously reserved for lords. The quarters woke in questions, soft at first, then sharp with fear, and Hannah's voice low, and plain, braided the air. Dew crossed the yard as if walking on the seam between worlds, and smoke rolled after her and folded back, unwilling to follow where she led it not to go. The fence line creaked where the gate had always sagged, and women with strong hips nodded to the men whose backs had memorized the lash, pointing them toward the dark that would keep them together. Together, but not now, out back to the canebrake. Take only what a hand can carry. She had counted that as well. The house behind them discovered its second voice. Beams talked in lengthy sentences before breaking into pieces. A window erupted. In a white yell, and names appeared. First names hurled, last names to a deity who had long been kept outside. The large house stood inside its wreath of heat, a lantern too full of its own light to see the night around it, and Hannah let her gaze hold it steady as she walked with her, taking in the sights and sounds of the field until it was a long, low murmur. A boy tugged at her skirt and asked if the fire would come for them. She replied, "Not if we move with the wind, not if we trust the ground, and we know better than they did." She guided them through the narrow throat of cane that swallowed them, around the sink where the rain created a mirror, and along the ruts where wagons had worn down the land. Water waited in the gourd at the hollow stump where she had once hidden a scrap of bread for a dog that walked like an owl. Owls stitched their high, slow wings through the darkness. The children's breath came like little engines. The women hummed. Beneath it, not with melody but with measure. At the heart of the break, she put them to rest beneath the green hush. The world often leaves the taking dirty, so she apologized, passed the gourd from mouth to mouth, and turned back by herself. She intended to tidy what she could, but in the tool shed, keys were lying like dull fish on a nail, and shackles hung with their jaws open. In order to reach the little corral behind the smokehouse, Stocks held a guy whose breath sounded like a broken step. She filed, listened to sparks leap in her lap, and used hatchet, file, and the coil of a chain rendered honest by new purpose. Wood failed somewhere near the pen. She knew the timings of neighbors who woke up early to worship, who napped during sermons, and the lock sighed and let the world in. The man stood tall and a little crooked, and once placed his hand on her shoulder as if he were swearing without words. Riders would come. She ran a rope across the low bridge where the creek gave the road its only grace and knotted it to a stump that had learned stubbornness from storms. In the cane, she showed the others where to step so nothing snapped. Where to practice with lean hounds. Fire writes a direction on the sky, and men who think they own the sky read it quickly. By morning, smoke wore the fields like a shawl. The house had collapsed inward, a beast finally submitting to the weight of its own bones. Men on horses circled the ruin, faces blamed, and she wrapped cloth around a crying baby's feet to turn. Sobs into breath. The quarters waited, empty as a held breath. The dogs nosed the road, then resisted at a bridge that suddenly had no heart. One hound yelped and tumbled. The others fell silent, as if recalling other nights they had failed to understand, and Hannah led her people along the backwaters of the creek to the cypress stand where roots rose like knuckles. Used, savage, thief, devil, and flung them at ashes that did not respond. She would go as far as the river asked her to, no farther, and become what a rumor becomes when it outlives the mouth that started it. Some would cross at the old ferry after dark and fold themselves into a different map. Others would remain hidden until the patrols had worn out their rage. She did not burn because she hated, but rather because they would not stop taking. Evening laid a cool hand on the land. Frogs set their old clocks to work. The children slept as if someone had finally told them a truth. A name that walked ahead of footsteps, Hannah said, a sentence spoken low in kitchens. Last Plume faded over the trees and thought about what to retain. The file she kept. The ledger inside her did not close. It did not need to. Debts had been answered in a language the house had taught without intending to. The little key went into the creek, a bright fish, and disappeared. When the wind shifted, she got up, kinder, and headed for the spot where the trail went to water. Her steps a pledge that could not be pledged.